The Handkerchief by Great 78. Chapter 50. Secrets Kept. Secrets Revealed. "You're late," a voice whispered from the shadowy darkness behind the angry wizard carved from marble. Two bright copper eyes shone at him. "What happened on the train?" "Which bit of it?" Draco asked sullenly. "All of it." She faced him, arms crossed, but he looked away guiltily. "Potter was using his invisibility cloak to spy on me and my friends." "And what did you do to him in retaliation?" "I stunned the tosser and broke his nose," he said, hoping it sounded tough and full of bravado, but knowing it didn't. "Draco!" she said angrily. She tried to touch his arm, but he pulled back before she could brush the tender spot on his left forearm. "I'm sorry for it, all right?" he huffed angrily. "I told that witch on the platform to go and look for him. I didn't just leave him there to get stuck on the train and have to go all the way back to London. But he can't just go around spying on me with his damn cloak, and getting away with shit like he's done for years, understand? Besides..." "Besides what?" "It's not like he's going to want to be around here this year. This year is going to make last year look like a sodding cakewalk." "In what way, Draco?" "Just that I have..." But the secrecy bonds had wrapped his tongue again, making him clamp his mouth closed. In frustration, he put one hand on his mouth, wrapping the other around his throat. His silver eyes shone with unshed tears, looking into hers, pleading for understanding. "My God, he's made you take a secrecy vow." Her mouth fell open, and her hands came to his waist. He closed his eyes and felt the warm tracks of his tears as they fell down his cheeks. She knew now. There was something terrible and harsh coming. Draco knew what it was, and could not tell her. She couldn't know what it was, but couldn't stop it from coming if she tried. "There's no way out of this," he choked out with his covered mouth. He lowered his head to her shoulder and brought his hands to her hips, tears coming faster, and she kissed his neck softly. "There's always a way," she assured him, showing off more of that damned Gryffindor bravery that he had come to both hate and admire. Then she raised up on her toes a bit, and he was lowering his head to slot his lips on hers, and the knot in his gut seemed to loosen and relax a bit. He awoke the next morning feeling better rested and somehow happier than he had in some time, likely since his time in Sandwich. Sod it. Her blind optimism had rubbed off on him a bit. The year might have gotten off to a bad start, but it was a new school year, after all. Who knew? Maybe Voldemort would get trampled by a dragon today, and he'd be off the hook. After breakfast, he made his way to the Ancient Runes classroom. As Newt's-level students, their numbers had been whittled down even further, and now only 16 6th and 7th years were enrolled. The other two Slytherins, both 7th years, paired up immediately for the term project, announced by Professor Babbling, leaving Draco as the only Slytherin without a partner. Two 7th-year Gryffindor wizards paired up, and Katie Bell, the only other girl Gryffindor, had paired with Genevieve Whittaker, a 7th-year Hufflepuff. This left Hermione and Draco partnerless, and catching Katie Bell's smirk in his direction, he concluded that it had been on purpose. These girls really did gossip. He nodded and smiled briefly at her in silent thanks, and turned to Hermione, expecting to get put directly to work, and have this 10-month-long in-depth runes translation project knocked out by lunchtime. "So, we didn't get to finish our conversation last night?" She smiled knowingly at him. That was true. After he'd calmed down a bit, they had snogged behind the Caldwell the Cantankerous statue for 10 more minutes before a strange beeping noise had interrupted them. Hermione had looked at her wrist, whispering "damn," and had rushed off, without an explanation, and only a few hurried words of goodbye. He had snuck down as unobtrusively as he could to the dungeons, yet still encountered Filch on patrol. It had taken a lengthy explanation about prefect scheduling mix-up to convince the old man to let him go. Draco had worried that he would need to confront the old squib, then had worried that doing so would put him out of commission for good. Filch had always seemed too many slices short of a loaf to be getting on with, anyway. "How so?" he asked quietly, casting a quick muffliato around them. Everyone else in class had done the same, as no one wanted anyone else to overhear their topic discussion. "Well, I seem to recall that you had your head in the lap of a certain someone, and that same witch was stroking your hair." Hermione pronounced the word witch with a harsh inflection. Yes, well, that. It turns out Pansy has had designs on me for going on about, 16 years now, give or take a bit." "Has she?" Hermione said drolly. "And where did she get that idea from?"
"Well, you remember I took her to Yule Ball. I never told you, but that night, she and I had a moment."
This last word came out in the same tone that she had pronounced the word witch. Hermione's eyes widened. "You told me in that hotel—"
No, not quite that kind of moment. We were in the corridor, outside of our common room, and suddenly she was on her knees. Honest to Merlin, I didn't know what she was going to do until she was already doing it. I didn't really want for it to happen. I kind of tried to get her to stop, but she was—" Draco looked down in embarrassment. "I mean, I guess it felt good in the moment, but not so much after. You see, I had someone else on my mind the whole time, and I felt bad about the whole thing after. Well, you know, after."
"After we kissed?" She smiled gently. He nodded. "Draco, I don't mean to sound presumptuous, but that sounds a bit like rape?" He sighed heavily and closed his eyes.
"Maybe. I've had that thought at times, but it's difficult to reconcile that. I finally had to decide that, as much as I didn't want it, I could have stopped it, and I didn't. And I think that there in the train, I still couldn't figure out how to stand up for myself and push her away once and for all. It's sort of a continual problem," he continued, thinking of the events of the summer at Riddle House. "So I'm sorry I didn't tell you about that before," he finished.
"Well, it's not like I told you what I had done earlier that night," she said primly. He looked up sharply.
"What had you done?"
"Nothing. Well, nothing quite as exposed as that. Victor, well, you know, he was a bit older and had more experience. We kissed, of course, and there may have been a bit of touching and rubbing." This last word she drew out reluctantly, with a hint of an embarrassed smile.
"You naughty minx, leading on 2 wizards at once," he chuckled teasingly. "Maybe Skeeter was right about you."
Hermione grinned at him like the Cheshire Cat. "Hell yeah, she was." They both laughed.
"So, was it a good date with Victor?"
Draco frowned, struggling to keep his tone even. He wasn't sure why he wanted to know, or even if he actually did. "It was awkward. I wasn't sure exactly what to do. Not that he needed much input from me. He was unfailingly polite, of course, just... I wasn't truly interested. I guess I had someone else on my mind as well."
"Well, apparently my encounter that night required a lot more input. I didn't know the proper etiquette going in, and I didn't give her a warning when things were, ending, if you know what I mean."
Hermione fought not to laugh. "Oh, Draco, you didn't!"
"Afraid so."
Their laughter died down awkwardly.
"So, was he your first kiss, I mean?"
Again he wondered why he was torturing himself this way. "No, I had a really close friend in school before I found out I was a witch. He was a sweet boy. Jacob is his name. We kissed on the day I left for Hogwarts. He came over to my parents' house to tell me goodbye." In Draco's mind there was a tan, sandy-haired boy, one that liked to climb trees and catch tadpoles in ponds. The kind of boy he would have been if he hadn't been forced into all of those etiquette and elocution lessons as a young child. Would Hermione have been happy,
staying in the muggle world. She could have gone to a normal school, married a normal boy like Jacob, and had beautiful copper-eyed children. What about you? Her words brought him back to the present. Oh, there was a quick kiss or two, here and there, before the thing with Parks. Tracy, I was maybe 10, about to turn 11, and Hannah Abbott, actually. We took dance lessons together as children. We were about 7 or 8. Hermione smiled with him at the memory. Do you ever wish, well, that you could go back, to that time with Jacob, before you came here? You could have gone to school with him, dated and gotten married and lived in a normal world without all this nonsense. No, I don't wish it. I would never want to go back to not knowing about magic. Her eyes danced at him. Besides, Jacob's boyfriend doesn't like to share. They laughed again, then set to their runes assignment. As luck would have it, he had Defense Against the Dark Arts with the rest of the 6th years next. He was a bit surprised by the sheer number of students. Every 6th-year Gryffindor was there, as were most of the 6th-year Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws. Only himself, Theo, and Blaise represented Slytherin House. Professor Snape immediately asked a question about non-verbal spells of the class, to which no one except Hermione had the answer. She rattled off the answer that sounded like it had come straight from a book. Snape called her out on it, and Draco couldn't help but giggle. The year may change, but some things could always be counted upon. She gave him an ugly look, then appeared to have a small coughing fit, for which she needed a handkerchief to cover her mouth. His pocket warmed. I can do a reducto curse right here, right now. Non-verbally, of course. He winked at her, then a few minutes later was able to answer. Don't jest. You know you would miss it. She blushed and smiled, then hurried to find a partner for their non-verbal spell work. Theo was at a table with Daphne, and Draco chose Blaise, which he immediately regretted. You're just going to be able to read my mind, and know what I'm about to do anyway, he complained in a whisper. Just use the Force, Blaise supplied loudly, which drew a handful of snickers from Dean Thomas, Hermione, and Justin Finch-Fletchley, who were parrying with their partners nearby. Draco didn't know what he meant, but guessed it to be a muggle thing. An hour later, Draco hadn't progressed much with non-verbal spells. The only positive was he was not the only one struggling. The singular success in the whole class was Hermione, of course, who had blocked a fairly decent jelly-legs jinx from Neville. He wasn't sure who was more surprised, Neville for casting it, or Hermione for blocking it non-verbally. He was inwardly bursting with pride for his witch. Next was arithmancy, and once again they were able to finagle a table together, without it being too obvious. As this class was mostly lecture today, however, they had to be content with only the occasional brush of fingers or knees beneath the table. And again she knew the answer to every question that Professor Vector lobbed at them. He could only smile at her and wonder. Next he had Care of Magical Creatures with Hagrid. He was surprised to find only 12 Newt-level students with just himself, Justin, Padma Patil, and a few other Hufflepuffs, representing 6th year. Draco found it hard to believe that Hermione and her 2 followers would give it up, seeing how much they liked Hagrid. The lesson was quite in-depth because there were so few of them, and without his usual contingent of Slytherins to impress, Draco found that he was able to focus much better. They studied a Diracawl that Hagrid had picked up in Mauritius that summer. Wouldn't peg you as much of an international traveller, Hagrid. I mean, after what happened last summer when you left the Isle. Draco joked quietly with the large man, when they had a moment alone. Ah, well, Olymp wanted to go, so we just went for a few days in July. Rented a boat, enjoyed the sun and the ocean, you know. Beautiful place, Mauritius. Good food, too. You know, your cousin Sirius told me about it last year. Made it sound real nice. Draco was pensive. I didn't know Sirius, but I've heard he was a good bloke. Oh, yeah. He gave me a motorbike once, did you know? Give you the shirt off your back, if you asked for it. Well, not that it fit, mind. Hagrid chuckled, and Draco smiled with him. Something about a wizard on a motorbike seemed to fit in with his idea of what Sirius must have been like. "You got lots of good in your family, Malfoy. Just got to know where to look for it. You got another cousin, stationed down in Hogsmeade now. You might have met her down that way when the express got here."
"No, I don't think—" But the memory of a pair of familiar eyes in the twilight that night changed his mind. "Maybe. Which cousin is that?"
"Nymphadora Tonks. She's Ted and Andromeda's girl. An Auror. Right smart she is."
So this explained the feeling that he knew her, that she seemed familiar to him. The feeling that she reminded him of his mother. Draco returned to his Diricawl diagram, but his mind kept wandering from the creature to thoughts of relatives he'd never known, and would never know. Chapter 51. Potions and Portends. It was in the class that followed where he most struggled to contain his pride in his witch, and to keep his composure. The final class of the day was double potions, and Draco marvelled that, somehow, he had lucked his way into an almost entire day of classes with her. There was no possibility of sitting together in this class, however. Professor Slughorn had set up the room with tables that sat 4. Blaise, Theo, and Daphne's presence meant that the 4 Slytherins would certainly sit together. Hermione sat with Ernie and the Wonder Duo. Considering that neither of them had ever scraped as much as an acceptable in class with Professor Snape, he was certain that it was mainly due to Hermione that the 2 of them were there at all. Professor Slughorn had 4 potions bubbling on the front of the table. As everyone filed into the room, they breathed deeply, taking in the intoxicating scents. Draco was unsure what the iridescent potion was, but it smelled of gardenias, cherries, and chocolate. He felt as though he could pour it into a bathtub and bathe in it for hours. He looked at Theo as they sat, and they exchanged lazy, euphoric smiles. Professor Slughorn began the class by talking about the various cauldrons.
"These are the types of potions you ought to be able to make after completing your NEWTs. You ought to have heard of them, even if you haven't made them yet. Can anyone tell me what this one is?"
Professor Slughorn gestured to the potion bubbling nearest their table. Draco looked at it carefully. If it had been in a glass, he would have assumed it was water. "It's Veritaserum, a colourless, odourless potion that forces the drinker to tell the truth," a swotty Gryffindor voice piped up.
Very good, said Professor Slughorn. "Now, this one here is pretty well known. Featured in a few ministry leaflets lately, too. Who can tell me—"
She had her hand up again. "It's Polyjuice potion, sir." Potter cocked his brow and gave her a knowing smirk that Draco wanted to know more about immediately.
Excellent. Now, this one here. Yes, my dear?" said Professor Slughorn, amused at his first experience with the know-it-all swot that everyone else in the class had known for 5 years. Draco struggled to hide his smile as the feeling of pride he had in his witch grew.
"It's Amortincia!" Hermione blushed slightly at these words, and at Professor Slughorn's acknowledgement. "It's the most powerful love potion in the world." Draco sat up straighter. This explained the smell, as well as the euphoria he felt, all the way down to his gut. The love potion smelled phenomenal, like nearly every memory he had of his times with her. She was now describing the potion's characteristics. "And it's supposed to smell differently to each of us, according to what attracts us, and I can smell freshly mown grass, and new parchment, and—" But she flushed and bit her lip, and did not finish. Draco was nearly salivating to know what the last thing she smelled in the Amortincia was. He would have to get it out of her, later. Professor Slughorn was nattering on again.
Granger? Could you possibly be related to Hector Dagworth Granger, who founded the most extraordinary society of potioneers?"
"No, I don't think so, sir. I'm Muggle-born, you see."
Draco leaned over to Theo and spoke loudly enough that Blaise could hear. "If this Hector Dagworth Granger is as hot as Blaise's mum, Granger would be president of the Slug Club by dinner hour. Blaise kicked him fiercely under the table, whilst he and Theo cracked up silently. This amortentia stuff really made one kind of loopy. Even with the impugn to his mother's honour, Blaise was still grinning lazily. Professor Slughorn was continuing to talk about the love potion. Theo took the chance to lean towards Draco and whisper, "Blaise is just bent out of shape because his love potion smells like cocktail onions and patchouli." Tears of laughter threatened to pour from Draco's eyes now, even in spite of the sharp look he was getting from Daphne Greengrass. "It is possibly the most dangerous and powerful potion in this room. Oh yes," Professor Slughorn said to the Slytherins, as though their laughter was a disagreement with his assessment. "When you have seen as much of life as I have, you will not underestimate the power of obsessive love." Draco sobered a bit. This was absolutely true, he supposed. After all, he had agreed to commit murder, in order to protect the person that this potion reminded him of. "And now it is time for us to start work." Professor Slughorn bustled around the table at the front of the room, ignoring the final cauldron filled with a molten gold liquid. Ernie Macmillan asked what it was, and Slughorn's answer had Draco sitting up to take notice. Felix Felicis. Liquid luck. Draco had read of the potion, of course. It was extremely difficult to make. Only master potioneers would even attempt it. Professor Slughorn was offering up a small vial of the stuff to the person who brewed the best potion in class. Draco was barely taking in his words. Liquid luck. You would succeed in all your endeavours. With that potion, he might be able to fix this cabinet so that he could get assistance with his mission. Hell, perhaps he'd be in a better mindset to actually carry out this ridiculous mission set to him. Or perhaps Professor Dumbledore would just pop his clogs naturally on his own around Easter and save Draco the trouble. Or maybe he could convince Hermione to run away with him. He needed that potion. Professor Slughorn gave him the assignment, and everyone started working zealously. Within 5 minutes, the room was alive with bubbling cauldrons, ingredients being chopped, stirring rods scraping clockwise circles on their thick cauldron bottoms. Professor Slughorn made his way to the Slytherin table. Inspiration struck. He just recalled that Lucius wasn't the only Malfoy that Slughorn knew. Lucius had once said that Professor Slughorn and his grandfather, Abraxas, had been classmates. Draco needed any preferential treatment that Slughorn could give him in order to win this prize. "Sir, I think you knew my grandfather, Abraxas Malfoy." "Yes," Professor Slughorn said, without looking at him. "I was sorry to hear that he'd died, although, of course, it wasn't unexpected. Dragon pox, at his age." "Yes, sir," said Draco, remembering the severity of the pox. He shuddered a bit and turned back to his potion. At the end of class, no one was surprised that the Felix Felicis had been won by someone at the Gryffindor table. The only surprise was which Gryffindor had won it. As they packed up, inspiration struck him again. Right next to their table was the large vat of polyjuice potion. If he couldn't have the Felix Felicis, perhaps he could use that to help him. He wasn't sure how, but it gave him more options than he had now. He summoned a few empty vials from his miniaturized travel potions kit, and filled them quickly, thankful that the rotund Professor Slughorn was so eager to get to dinner. The following day was not quite as busy, with charms, herbology, divination, and transfiguration classes. He was pleased to see Hermione in all but divination, where he didn't expect her anyway. He smiled ruefully to himself. Maybe divination was worth something after all. At least, that particular prediction had come true. Stepping into Sybil Trelawney's classroom was always like stepping into an odd, living daydream. What with its tiny, delicate furniture, wafting smoke, and dim red lighting. The students, as usual, moved into the room as though they were not at all certain they were supposed to be in there. There were just 6 of them here. the 2 Gryffindor girls that shared the dormitory with Hermione, Terry Boot, Susan Bones, and Blaise. "Still taking this class, you tosser," Draco murmured as he passed Blaise. "Easy-o on my NEWTs," the other wizard said boredly. In this class they were encouraged to sit with a member of a different house, which is how, directly, he found himself seated opposite Parvati Patel. She looked like the Kneazle that had caught the canary, and Draco was forcibly reminded of their brief interaction on the train last Christmas. "Today you will be working with the Ouija board. This artifact is known to allow the user to contact the dead, to read minds." Professor Trelawney droned on and on about this miraculous board, and Draco privately thought that it was also good for parting a fool with his galleons, but all that was neither here nor there right now. Their hands were placed on the Ouija board, and Parvati asked him, "Do you have anyone in the great beyond that you'd like to make contact with?" "Not really. All my dead relatives are better left dead," he drawled, even as an image from the Daily Prophet of a long-haired Sirius Black flashed upon his mind. It was rather hard to concentrate, what with Lavender Brown and Blaise loudly calling into the great beyond for her lost baby bunny rabbit, Squeaky. "Well, how about a mind-reading session?" Parvati gave him a wicked grin. Her eyes rolled back, and her hands were hovering over the board in an instant, shifting the planchette around rapidly without even seeming to touch it. Draco could see how this could be mystifying to some. "You seem to be thinking of someone special. She's quite beautiful, in spite of the fact that her hair gets onto and into everything. I mean, literally everything. Everywhere." The witch cracked one eye at Draco. "Am I close?" When class ended, he and Blaise trudged back down the endless tower stairs to the great hall. "Did you manage to contact Squeaky, then?" Draco asked, in a mock-polite tone. "Oh, yes. The old chap was positively smashing. He had 438 children, and 82,216 grand bunnies, and he told us to kindly fuck off because he was busy." Draco gave a low whistle. 438 children. I suppose he was smashing. Left, right, and centre. And 16 times on Sunday. Blaise nodded thoughtfully. "You're a total ass." Draco laughed. The first Saturday night of term was traditionally the Slytherins' first party of the year. Younger students were given impossible tasks to complete, far beyond their magical level, for the amusement of the older students. Second and third years were allowed to stay up all night and try a bit of mulled wine or fire whiskey, depending on the moral fibre and willingness to share of the upperclassmen. But no one takes attendance. No one cares if anyone sneaks off on their own, so after imbibing in a few shots of fire whiskey and playing a few rounds of poker, Draco was feeling fine and decided to ask Hermione to meet in the room of requirement at 9. The hallways were empty except for Peeves, who was using black paint to put mustaches on a painting of 4 wizards on a manticore hunt. The 4 were protesting loudly, but refused to leave behind their dead quarry and escape the poltergeist. He rounded the corner, and a tinkling of bangles in the distance gave him only a few seconds' warning of Professor Trelawney approaching him. He jumped sideways behind a tapestry and nearly toppled over from the fire whiskey. Professor Trelawney was reading her tarot cards as she walked, which seemed a poor decision on her part. The lady could barely see where she was going normally. Putting ambiguously magical cards in the mix seemed to be asking for trouble. The Empress reversed. Tyranny, coldness. The Hanged Man reversed. Stalling. Fear of sacrifice. No. Let me shuffle again. She continued to drift down the corridor, and Draco was able to carry on. He rounded another corner and ran chest first into his own head of house. Professor Snape appeared to be on patrol, though Draco privately thought that it didn't matter if Snape was attending a Ministry of Magic gala or a Muggle car boot sale. He would still wear those swishy black robes. "Mr. Malfoy, out for a walkabout?" Professor Snape asked in a normal tone of voice. Then he lowered it to a near whisper. "I trust you remember the contraception charm, Draco?" "Ugh, Merlin Snape, of course." Draco made to stride away from the man. The quicker the better, but Professor Snape caught his arm. "As it turns out, I am pleased that I saw you tonight. I wondered if we might speak," the professor said, casting a subtle non-verbal muffliato. "Certainly, sir." He wondered how long it would take. Curfew for 6th and 7th years was 11 tonight, and he didn't fancy meeting August Filch after hours. Patrols on the first Saturday night of term were always increased. "It will not take long," Professor Snape said, as though in answer to Draco's unasked question. Draco blushed and focused on his occlumency walls once again. He'd not felt the need to use occlumency as much since being back at Hogwarts, and had welcomed the short reprieve. "Sorry, sir." "I merely wanted to ask," Professor Snape continued as though Draco hadn't spoken, "about the task given to you by the Dark Lord." Draco felt his stomach lurch, and suddenly the fire whiskey seemed a bit foolish. "Task, sir?" "Yes. You've been told to complete a mission, and I want to hear from you what it is, and what plans you have for how to complete it." I'm not sure what you mean, Professor." "Do not play dumb with me, Draco. We have known each other for 5 years, and I can tell when you're lying." Behind his walls, Draco dimly registered that he wasn't the only liar standing in the corridor tonight. "No, you can't," he said, the fire whiskey giving him added boldness. "You taught me too well, sir." This last word was accompanied by a sneer. "The time will come, Draco, that you need me. Well, I know where to find you when I do." Draco turned to go, a bit surprised by his own backbone. Hermione was waiting in the room of requirement when he arrived, a roaring fire in the grate. He rushed into her arms with barely a word, pressing her into the wide sofa with his soft but urgent kisses, his confident, eager hands. 30 minutes later, his platinum hair fell over his eyes, and his breath caught in a low, urgent growl as he breathed out her name. They lay together, spent, the heat from their bodies meeting the cool chill of the air around them. He thought to himself that Professor Trelawney must have missed a card. The lovers. Partnership. Duality. Union. She lay her head down upon his chest, and he played with the perfect coils that had formed in her hair as her body heat rose. He was certain of one thing. The hanged man might be an omen of the fear of sacrifice. But if sacrifice is what it took to stay on Voldemort's good side and secure his witch's safety, he would do whatever was in his power.
Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great 78.